I'm going to concentrate mostly on the transatlantic relationship, but the United States has a peculiar location on the planet because it has a European destiny, its oldest destiny, a Pacific destiny, an Asian destiny, as well as a Latin American destiny. When I say that you're going to listen to an American, it's a very peculiar American, but a typical American at the same time. Because the longer I live in Europe, and I've lived in France for almost 40 years, the more I realize how European the United States is. And the longer I live in Europe, the more I realize how, in so many ways, Europe, that Europeanness of America, which has been Americanized, has come back around to influence Europe. That's that organic relationship that a previous speaker talked about, that long-term cultural connection between Europe and the United States. And I think I can conclude from looking at your symbol here that you've given a very privileged place to the North Atlantic, and that somehow you see yourselves as an important part of a transatlantic civilization. And I think there is a transatlantic civilization. But what has made America, what has given America this Americanness that has come back around to influence that Europeanness that gave something to America? It's because the United States is one of those civilizations, and we've just heard that India is another one. The United States is one of those civilizations that is the product of globalization. That first wave of globalization that began with the 15th century, the 16th century, historians recognize this period of history as a period of great migration, of economic exchange, of cultural exchange, of the exchange of germs and viruses, which unfortunately had a devastating impact on the indigenous population that existed on the other side of the Atlantic before the arrival of Europeans. So the United States is the American, or let's call it American civilization, is a civilization that is a product of globalization. And I think that makes Americans comfortable with globalization. It makes them comfortable and ready to adapt to it and profit from it. There's always a fear when another culture, and we heard this morning when we had a discussion of the Roman Empire, there's always a fear that something of your own culture is going to be eradicated or transformed in such a way that you will never recognize it again. But you know, in most of history, and I follow the great French sociologist Lévi-Strauss here, when different cultures interact, in general, not always, in general, both profit. The differences brought make a new synthesis that can be enriching. That can be enriching. What is it that made America different from Europe? It's the product of globalization of many civilizations. It wasn't only Europeans, and particularly the British. It's something else I share with the Indian ambassador, the influence of British civilization on America. It wasn't only Europeans that influenced, that gave the United States that organic nature. There were over 12 million Africans who were forcibly brought to the New World. 6% of those came to the United States, and they've contributed to the culture of the United States. We have a president today who has an African father. It's part of the progress that the United States has made. Those Africans who were forcibly, for the most part, brought to the United States have had the longest and most difficult time integrating into that organic culture of America. But they come from elsewhere also, from China, from Asia, from all parts of Europe, from Latin America. It's that mixture that took what was European, transformed it into what was American, and then brought it back to all those other parts of the world. So that American civilization has built in an organic way a kind of international mass culture that you may or may not like. It has created an international mass culture that has not been forced on other civilizations. Nobody here is forced to go to McDonald's, but I see it's full. Okay. So there must be something attractive in that civilization. And I think it's more than culture. We talked today about giving up sovereignty. It is possible, and I think diplomats understand this. It's possible, and political leaders understand this. It's possible to give up some of your sovereignty and benefit. It's not always negative to share or to give up some sovereignty. National interests can be further developed and advanced by giving up, pooling, and sharing sovereignty. Americans did this in their own history. We have a federal state. This is part of our technical integration. Americans integrated themselves. Every American in some sense has double nationality. I'm from California. I'm a Californian. I have to pay taxes in California when I live there. There's a California criminal code. But I'm also an American. So there is a certain comfort in that American outlook on the world that sees that you can be two citizens at the same time and still be patriotic. You can be a European patriot and you can be a Ukrainian patriot. And I don't think that's contradictory. And I don't think you should see it as contradictory. And I think being a European patriot, if you see yourself as part of that transatlantic community, and I think the Ukrainians would like to see themselves, from what I understand, to be part of that transatlantic community. I think there's no contradiction or undermining of culture or sovereignty. I think that you should take what's best from that integration and use it for yourselves. Now, the American image, the American views of European integration, already you can see that for Americans, viewing Europe integrating is seeing their own history repeated. They did this. Americans failed in their first attempt at integration. With their first constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation, there wasn't enough national power. The Americans had to go back to the drawing board with a new constitutional convention to build a stronger federal or national government. Americans have failed several times in their history. They fought a terrible civil war. That's a failure of compromise. It's a failure of democracy. It was a cultural failure because it represented the inability to reconcile the values of democracy with forced labor up until the American Civil War. But when Americans came twice to Europe in the 20th century, they could see that European conflict, which became, in both cases, a global conflict. I'm talking about World War I and World War II. For Americans, it was easier to see that as a European civil war among yourselves. A Europe divided, and violently divided. So when Americans look at Europe, once again, they're still seeing and they're projecting, and it's common for all people, projecting their own vision, their own culture, their own civilization onto others. But since they're also Europeans, they had this intimate connection with Europe. So for American policymakers of the 20th century, and I'm speaking now of a couple of generations, for American policymakers, they look back on the history of the 20th century and their relationship with Europe, which is a very strong cultural relationship and economic relationship, but they saw that twice in the 20th century, Americans came back to Europe to finish two European civil wars. And each time they came back to finish two European civil wars, they were always with the democracies. That doesn't mean that the democracies were always on the same side with the United States, but the democracies in both World War I and World War II were on the same side. And for the policymakers who came of age after that second terrible European Civil War, which was a global war as well, they never again wanted to send American soldiers, American armored divisions, American artillery back to Europe to finish another American Civil War. So viewing themselves as Americans through their Europeanness, they concluded that to prevent that ever happening again, it was necessary, even vitally necessary, to support European integration. Let's be clear, the United States has, since the end of World War II, up until today, has always, and I say always, been in favor and supportive of European integration for several reasons. And I believe the first reason is that security reason. That a secure Europe at peace with itself will always support American security and American peace. After World War II, it was understood that the security of the United States was indivisible with the security of Europe, even during that time when Europe was divided between a liberal Europe with open markets and a non-liberal communist Europe. So there was always this underlying security motivation in the supporting of European integration. But how was that to be done? Americans being a business civilization also. And Americans usually think like this and never forget it. They'll start thinking like business people. They said, how are we going to create the secure, peaceful Europe? And the idea, and this was the idea shared by Jean Monnet, the father of Europe. Jean Monnet was a cognac merchant. His family was in the cognac business. And his father told him, he never finished his baccalaureate, Jean Monnet. His father told him, Jean, go out, always open your eyes, open your ears, listen and learn. And it was Jean Monnet who understood, or it was his idea, that in order to build that unified, integrated Europe, you start with business. Of course, a businessman's going to start thinking like this first. You build a Europe congenial to business, regulated, that creates economic integration. Economic integration requires a kind of administrative core of elites that are European, that's administrative integration. That underlines the necessity, or calls for the necessity for a political integration. Political integration, therefore, creates a zone of compromise and peace. And, you know, we all have the privilege here of living in that, almost all of us, I think, in that zone of prosperity and peace. And let's be frank, freedom. The freedom to express ourselves here, the freedom to publish what we want, to have clean, transparent, competitive elections where you really have a different team at the top instead of recycling them from one period to the other. A professional, neutral public administration committed to the national interest and not to personal interests, either personal economic interests or personal political interests. You know, this is an American speaking American to you. I just think that's a better place to live than most other places where you have that. And I believe that most people on this planet would agree to that. But I'm not saying here, I'm not asking you to become American. You must remain Ukrainian. But you can find, the history of the Ukraine itself is a history of synthesis, of the crossing of civilizations. And boy, do you live in a difficult part of the planet, where all kinds of civilizations have traversed your territory and left something. Each has left something different. And you've made your synthesis. That's what it meant to be Ukrainian. If you've done that so successfully up until now, you can, of course, do that successfully as part of a larger transatlantic community. So the Americans did that for security reasons, but they're business people. They're entrepreneurs. And when they looked at a unified Europe, they also saw, and let's be frank about this, they saw a bigger market. And if you're a business leader, you prefer one big, uniform, standardized market with the same rules, because you always have to have rules. You prefer one big market to 27 small markets where the rules are different and the electric plugs are different, and where things are predictable, where there's a rule of law, where the banking system is solid, where your public accounts and your tax system are honest, transparent, and predictable. There's no secret to drawing investment or capital from elsewhere. It's to have a tax system and a public administration system that are neutral and fair and have integrity and are predictable, and aren't there to serve the interest of any one particular political party, political person, or economic interest. So let's be frank, Americans like the idea of European Europe because it was better for business. That's undeniable. Okay, you can say that's, capitalist imperialism or the imposition of, multinational corporations. You can also see it as growing integration that allows the flow of capital for investment and innovation. But the Americans, up until the end of the Cold War, had an ideological motivation for the integration of Europe. They looked at Europe after World War II and they saw it was going to be divided between what they had the habit of calling the free world and the non-free world. That was the way people talked in those days. Okay. And they said, if we don't want to have another military confrontation in Europe, how can we protect our part of Europe, Western Europe, from communist expansion? And the conclusion was, and this is seen as probably the most successful program in the history of American diplomacy, was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, the conception was, we will help our European friends and allies on our side. We'll help them help themselves. We'll help them help themselves by rebuilding their economies, their economic infrastructure, so they can build political self-confidence. We're going to show the other side, the communist side, that we can bring more freedom, more prosperity, more well-being than the other system can. Okay. And this was conceived as a long-term strategy. The father of this strategy, who was a young diplomat in Moscow before World War II, George Kennan. George Kennan, a young diplomat, saw this as a long-term, this was strategic thinking in the long term that was successful. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, George Kennan was over 90 years old. And he had the privilege at the end of his life to see his strategy pay. And there was a scene when George Kennan walked into the Senate hearing room of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and everybody stood up spontaneously and applauded. So, this is not to say that Americans are only philanthropic or only generous. They're that too. Europe was suffering after World War II. They are also philanthropic, but they're also interested in making a profit. Okay. But they're very, very emotionally and even passionately attached to their civil religion. And their civil religion is that religion of democracy. And when it's that passionate, you can't convince an American that anything else is better than that. And you just normally think that everybody else would want to have that. Maybe sometimes that blinds them, but that's how Americans are. So the United States has always been in favor of integration. It's only part of the American position in the planet. The Americans are now also, particularly with the new pivot to Asia of President Obama, supportive of integration in Asia for the same reasons, as well as if it can be carried out in Latin America. It's the regionalism that the ambassador told us about. So that integration was both organic and technical. It was complex. All civilizations are complex. The American civilization is complex, particularly because so many different cultures have fed into it. So the Americans have always looked at European integration as positive, as profitable, and they naturally want to see it be as pervasive as possible, because when they look at the world in that way, they're looking at a mirror. They're looking at themselves. So even though we have disputes with different countries in Europe, even though some Europeans think that they are not like us, those Americans, that's superficial. That the underlying fundamentals are shared, and they're strong. And whenever those fundamentals are threatened, we are always all together.